Hello everyone. This is the second video lecture of the second week, Beginnings of the Archaeology in the Middle East. And in this video, I would like to present the story of some of the earliest explorations of the Middle East, documenting and researching the ancient past in the region, with starting with some travelers going all the way back to 17th century and onwards, but mainly I'm going to try to focus on the 19th century, particularly sort of large-scale excavations that were sponsored by institutions like the British Museum, the Louvre, the Vorderasiatische Museum in Berlin, and among others. And we will hear more about those institutions and the idea of the Imperial Museum in the third video lecture after this one. We can study this historical process in several episodes of action, sort of starting with the work of the early travelers, antiquarians, and diplomats who happened to be assigned to various parts of the Middle East to do their work. And while they are there because of their own interests and also their connections with institutions in the West, they start exploring archaeological remains in the region and starting to map them, collect materials, and so on. Sometimes with a permit from the Ottoman Sultan in Constantinople, sometimes not. But mainly the early archaeological work that we're going to talk about really focus on the sort of former provinces of Mosul, Basra, and Baghdad in Iraq. That was all sort of really managed by the Ottoman government in Istanbul, in Constantinople, during the 19th century. And so what we see happening is that these sort of diplomats and antiquarians and travelers sort of engage with the history of the Middle East for various different reasons. In this lecture, I'm really focusing on the first two, including the rediscovery and also the early archaeological work that we're going to look at, particularly around the middle of the 19th century, particularly guided by the sort of interests of finding the biblical places mentioned in those biblical texts, particularly. Actually, by the time, sort of by really early 19th century, Europeans really didn't know much about Near Eastern cultures and languages, particularly both cultures and languages, except for these biblical texts, really. The languages such as Akkadian and Sumerian were not deciphered yet, or Hittite or Luvian. It was really everything really we knew about Near Eastern civilizations, Near Eastern cultures were limited to sort of what you would read in the classical authors like Herodotus or Strabo, or the biblical text. So none of those were really known. And so this is a map of this kind of really Syria, Mesopotamia, and part of Anatolia, south of Anatolia, southeast of Anatolia, under the control of the Ottoman Empire in the early to mid-19th century. And we're going to really talk a little bit about first, actually, to talk about Napoleon Bonaparte's expedition to Egypt in the beginning of the 19th century. And then we're going to focus on excavations in the Mosul province, especially by the British Museum in Nimrud. So in 1625, an Italian noble, Pietro della Valle, had visited archaeological mounds in southern Iraq. Later, we would learn that he had collected cuneiform tablets during his visits, particularly from one mound, Tel al-Mughayr, which turned out to be the ancient city of Ur, the famous ancient city of Ur, that's also mentioned in the Bible. So he had spotted this kind of wedge-shaped writing on clay tablets. I'm showing you one example right next to Pietro della Valle's portrait. And these are called sort of cuneiform writing because of this kind of cuneiform means wedge-shaped writing, because of the way that the stylus is kind of really dipped into the clay. And whenever travelers actually visited these archaeological sites, they would come across these cuneiform tablets. They became particular of interest as souvenirs, as sort of relics from biblical times for many serious Bible readers. And so as early as 17th century, these cuneiform tablets started to circulate. Actually today, if you visit any kind of seminary in the US, you would be able to and ask them, they would probably be able to produce a number of tablets from their drawer, which had been collected from the 19th century onwards. Simply, these may be some kind of a random document, but they were collected as biblical relics. And so Karl Neuber, who was a German mathematician, geographer, and explorer who worked for the Danish government, participated in the Royal Danish Arabia expedition of 1761 to 1767, and served for this particular expedition as an explorer. So you see an illustration of Karl Neuber wearing, on the right, wearing an attire of an Arab notable in Yemen. It was a costume that was kind of really gifted to him by a Yemeni imam. And it was particularly a kind of an Orientalist trope to actually get such an image produced, that you wear the local attire and have a portrait made. He visited not only Arabia but also Iran, made it to Persepolis, and copied some of the triangular inscriptions, trilingual inscriptions, which later proved to be a major step towards the decipherment of Akkadian and other Near Eastern languages. And I'm showing you his drawing, his illustration of the ruins of Persepolis in Iran, and also the map of Mosul and environs that he had prepared in 1776. And so he prepared during his trip. He was a lot more systematic, and he prepared a lot of maps of the areas that he had visited. A similar sort of imperial expedition to that Danish one is Napoleon Bonaparte's scientific expedition to Egypt, which took place between 1799 to 1802. as part of the French Revolutionary Wars, immediately following Napoleon's conquest of Egypt in 1798. So after this conquest, actually, Napoleon turned his military campaign into a scientific one, a form of cultural imperialism, and brought with him 167 scholars, scientists, to document, basically, to meticulously document historic and archaeological monuments of Egypt that were sort of really extant, not excavation, but everything that's actually on the ground, as well as documenting its natural history. All of this extraordinary work was published in a total of 23 volumes, with 9 volumes of text. This is one of the most comprehensive surveys of any corpus of archaeological and historical heritage from this actually time period. In the previous lecture, we discussed Orientalism and its visual culture, and particularly in painting and photography. We talked about Jerome and Antoine Sérigoyen. But we can expand that here to architectural and archaeological illustration, where a series of romantic landscapes of ruins in the Egyptian countryside is depicted with really dramatic effects, usually with some local Egyptians serving as a scale to these enormous ruins. And you see a series of examples, both sort of architecture from different time periods, both sort of ancient Egyptian monuments like the Sphinx and the pyramids, but also some Greco-Roman temples, and also some Islamic monuments that we see in this set of drawings. And also, like, the documentation of flora and fauna also is just as impressive as the architectural documentation as well. So the campaign, in the end, was a military failure. The French army was kicked out soon by the British. But this colossal documentary work really remains. Now, moving from these kind of early explorations, these early exploratory expeditions, I'd like to move to excavations in the middle of the 19th century. The first example that I'd like to sort of really give is Austin Henry Laird's excavations in around Mosul, particularly at the site of Nimrud. Henry Laird is a British adventurer turned diplomat. He was sent to Ceylon to work as an attorney, but he, on his way to Ceylon, he got fascinated with the Middle East, and he never actually went beyond Iran as well. But he stayed in the Middle East. He got into contact when he decided that he wanted to stay and spend time in the Middle East. He got in touch with the British ambassador in Constantinople, who then financed and supported Laird to carry out excavations in Mosul, and so particularly in Nimrud, he was super interested in archaeology, and then he was sent to Mosul on an unofficial diplomatic mission to fulfill his archaeological interests. So between 1845 and 1851, for about 6 years, he carried out excavations at the site of Nimrud, the ancient Assyrian city of Kalho, Actually, he was quite lucky. The first place that he started excavating in the citadel of Kalhu turned out to be the major Assyrian palace on that particular site. Although he mistakenly thought that he was excavating Nineveh, and so all of his publications really talk about the sort of remains of Nineveh or ruins of Nineveh, where he was actually excavating Kalhu. He also had an assistant, Hurmuzd Ressam, who's depicted here on the left, a native Christian, a Chaldean Catholic, who was trained with him during the excavations, and he continued on with his own excavations even after Henry Laird left. And so what they hit was actually a massive Assyrian palace, the northwest palace of Assur-Nasir-Pal II from the 9th century. And it featured these kind of massive architectural sculpture in limestone. And we will study this building in detail when we get to the Assyrians in the Iron Age later in the semester. So I won't dwell on this building very much. But I want to sort of really point out that their archaeological technique was not entirely... it was a little primitive and really mainly involved sort of tunneling and extracting sculpture through these tunnels. And sort of any archaeologist, any scientific archaeologist today would look at this and say this is crazy. A very destructive method, not paying attention to any stratigraphy, destroying a lot of historical information, and so on. But that was kind of really the mid-19th century technology. All he was interested really was pretty much really excavating, extracting this sculpture and sending them to the British Museum. Mr. Laird published his findings in Nineveh and in this 2-volume book, Nineveh and Its Remains, again, mistakenly labeled as Nineveh because he was actually excavating Kalhu. And this book actually became a bestseller in Europe at the time and made Laird quite famous. And his book was full of Orientalist representations of excavations of the palaces. You see some of his illustrations still being used in textbooks, and you can see some of these right here. The excavated sculptures were shipped then to the British Museum. And in the next lecture, in the third lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about this process and what happens to that sculpture on their way to the British Museum. In 1842, Paul-Émile Botta, who used to be a physician and a botanist, was appointed as a French consul in Mosul, and he was also a big advocate and sort of amateur archaeologist. And this was a very convenient position for him to start excavations. Presents us a really great example of this kind of contest, this kind of different colonial powers, different diplomatic missions trying to get hold of particular archaeological sites. He first explored the site of Kuyunjuk, which later turned out to be the city of Nineveh. That's where Laird really wanted to excavate, but he had missed it. But Botta was very unsuccessful. He couldn't really find much, and he was very disappointed with his excavations on the Nineveh. And so he got later interested in a nearby site, the site of Khorsabad, about 20 kilometers away from Mosul. Later, after his excavations, we will know that this was the site of one of the most sort of spectacular Assyrian sites, Dur Sharukin, you see a reconstruction of it in the middle. Founded by Assyrian King Sargon II in the 8th century, where he excavated a gigantic palace complex between 1843 and 1845 on the behalf of the Louvre Museum. He worked with the artist Eugene Flandin, who really beautifully illustrated the Assyrian reliefs and sculptures that Emil Botta was excavating. And I'm showing you some examples of his really extraordinary drawings. And it was really convenient, and it was really important that he did these detailed drawings. Because what happened is that when Botta shipped some of the sculptures to the Louvre, and they were sailing down some of these sculptures, and they sank into the Tigris River and were never recovered, unfortunately. So a lot of these sculptures that we only know from Flandin's drawings, and they're lost in the bottom of the river and buried probably now, but with sort of lots of alluvium. So pretty impossible to find them. Here, I'd like to wrap up my lecture today, this one with a note on the decipherment of cuneiform Akkadian script, which also took place in the 19th century, alongside as these excavations were going on. Henry Rawlinson here, who was acting as an intelligence officer for the East India Company, was posted to Iran as a military advisor, and he worked in Kermanshah in western Iran, where he had access to a series of rock monuments, particularly this important monument carved by the Persian king Darius the First, which is at the site of Bisitun. This is a very famous inscription because it is trilingual. So the text there was written in 3 languages, including the Babylonian dialect of Akkadian, Old Persian, as well as Elamite. And so this Rawlinson already had worked on Old Persian, which was really a lot closer. Elamite was syllabic, and then Akkadian in cuneiform, undeciphered. So he worked very closely on the Old Persian text, which was kind of really easiest for him, and this gave fruit, and he presented the translation of his sort of Old Persian inscription to the Royal Asiatic Society in 1837. This decipherment was absolutely crucial for the decipherment of Akkadian itself and eventually other Near Eastern languages which used actually cuneiform writing. So by 1851, Rawlinson and other scholars already were deciphering Akkadian in comparison to the Old Persian text, and they were able to read at least 200 cuneiform signs by 1851. All of these developments actually led to very exciting result of reading thousands of cuneiform tablets that had been collected earlier. And they also came from excavations that Austin Henry Laird and others have done in Mesopotamia. For example, this tablet on the left, a large tablet, which turned out to be part of a portion of the Epic of Gilgamesh that was acquired from an Assyrian library in Nimrud. This tablet became very famous with George Smith, who was then an assistant and Assyriologist in the British Museum, and he was reading these tablets that Austin Henry Laird's team had brought. And he realized that the portion that there was a moment when he was reading this tablet, he realized that it was telling the story of the flood as part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and he became extremely excited. And according to the witnesses, he started undressing himself, I guess from excitement. And he eventually translated the Epic of Gilgamesh and was a pioneering Assyriologist. Actually, he became very famous when he actually took off to go to Iraq, to Mosul, to look for the missing part of the tablet in that he was working on, the flood tablet. In fact, he went back to Nimrud. He went through the excavation piles of Hormuz Ressam and Austin Henry Laird, and to the astonishment of everyone, he actually found the missing parts of this flood tablet. And so he has also done other sort of travel and archaeological work there too. So I'm going to stop here for this lecture that kind of really hopefully gave you an impression of the sort of really beginnings of excavations in the Middle East. In the next and final video lecture, I'd like to talk about the Imperial Museum and to see how those artifacts that are excavated in Middle Eastern sites were transferred to Western museums, and how they were curated eventually. So thank you.